In this brief video clip, we're going to talk briefly about the factors of causation, and then we're going to go on to really try to stress that association does not equal causation. These are the four groupings of factors of causation that we're going to discuss: predisposing, reinforcing, enabling, and precipitating. And then we'll go on to talk about the fact that association does not necessarily mean causation. So let's think about predisposing factors. Some examples would be things like sex, age, and genes. So for example, people who are over the age of about 60 might not have such a favorable outcome should they become infected with COVID-19. Reinforcing factors are things like if you're repeatedly exposed, then that would be a reinforcing factor. Somebody who repeatedly indulges in risky sex behavior, more likely then to end up with HIV infection. Enabling or disabling factors might be living conditions, services, skills, resources, that sort of thing. And precipitating factors, well, again, you might have lead poisoning or an infection with an infectious disease, then that would be something that precipitates the onset of the disease. So I'm turning now to talk about the issue of association not being the same as causation. And I give you an example here from the late Dr. Wynne Castle, who found an association between the average number of cats owned by elderly people in the British city of Leeds and the price of coal mined in Pittsburgh in the USA. Clearly, it would be very difficult to find some sort of causal link between those two things that happened in completely different communities on the other side of the sea. So an association is a statistical relationship only between an exposure and an outcome. You have to then go on to decide, based on a number of criteria, whether that association is likely or not to be causal. I'm going to give a rather glaring example of a kind of study design that you've already covered that is particularly prone to the fact that or leads us to have to be very careful about assuming that an association is causal, and that is the ecological study design. Remember, those are studies where the exposure and the outcome are measured at a group and not at an individual level. So here on this graph, you see we've got a number of countries, and it appears that as the per capita or per head daily meat consumption goes up, so the colon cancer incidence rate goes up. So New Zealand has the most meat consumption and the highest colon cancer. Nigeria has the lowest meat consumption and the lowest cancer, colon cancer. So let's think about that, and we'll talk some more about it. So we found out that there was a strong relationship, an association between meat consumption and colon cancer. This would support a theory that meat consumption is a cause of colon cancer. But remember the so-called ecological fallacy. The women who eat more meat may not be the same women who develop colon cancer. So when you go and look at the individual level, you find that this relationship may not hold out. There are also many other differences between those countries, such as socioeconomic status, stress levels, and so on, which could also have caused the lung cancer. And so that it's a mere association that we're seeing, not necessarily causal. So one cannot be certain that the relationship in the graph is not just due to one of these other factors, so-called confounding factors. So what has that ecological study contributed? Well, it was very cheap, very quick. The data are readily available in various publications. You can do that in an afternoon. But what it's told us is it's worth doing a more careful study now to see whether the association exists at the individual level, and also in which we compare and include other exposures that could be causal and we adjust for confounding. So that's giving us justification now to go on into a more time-consuming and expensive study. In conclusion, association does not prove causation. Not all associations are causal. They might be, but you need more information before you can decide.